Hi, I'm Kyle Pearson. I'm a solutions engineer here at Greylog, and today I'm going to talk to you about how you can reduce risk by prioritizing use case development in your SIM. So as mentioned, I'm a solutions engineer here at Greylog. What I do day to day is kind of work with all our prospects and our customers with all their technical needs regarding our product. Previously, I kind of started out in security as a security engineer in various financial services and particularly banks here in the UK, where I kind of worked on mature and SIM solutions and around cloud security controls. I've also been a consultant for several years at various SIM vendors with HP and Micro Focus for ArcSight and with Elastic for their security product. Particularly what I'm good at is I specialize in kind of holding the hands of our customers for everything they need in their technical journey. And if you've ever worked with me, you'll know that basically everything I do, I draw lines and boxes for. So that's my superpower. So you might kind of ask why I'm kind of talking to you about risk today and not something really cool to do with what you can do with Greylog. And the reason for this is really because I love talking technical. You know, I talk about technical things all day with our customers. But one of the things that really fascinates me when it comes to cybersecurity is kind of how the things that we talk in the technical space translate to kind of those people that are non-technical, maybe executives, maybe CIOs and people like that. Because like it or not, you know, decisions are made in rooms like in this image, in the boardrooms where maybe non-technical people are the only people present. So firstly, I just wanted to kind of talk about what risk is and how we deal with that. So risk really is kind of the potential for loss, disruption, or damage to your organization. It could be financial loss, it could be reputational, or it could just be technology that no customers ever see but causes you pain. Risk at its core is really defined as kind of how likely something is to happen, the probability of an incident, and the amount of impact that it can have if that thing happens. So it's generally probability times the impact. And really why this is important is because in reality, kind of cybersecurity is really just a risk management exercise. Everything we do in cybersecurity is really just about mitigating the potential impact to our organizations from a security incident. So how do we manage risk? So now we kind of understand what risk is. How do we manage it? In general, organizations do one of three things when they identify some form of risk. They either just accept the risk and do nothing, which is basically where they define, you know, the probability or the impact isn't generally enough for them to really worry about it and spend money to actually do something about it. It also kind of depends on the risk appetite of the organization that you work for. Some organizations are perfectly happy accepting risks that other organizations wouldn't, because there might be certain things that there's a larger impact for not accepting them. Some organizations might choose to mitigate risk. So this is kind of where our SIM fits in. You know, we build technology, we implement capabilities, we implement process, we implement controls to kind of prevent the risk that we've identified from happening. We might also choose to transfer the risk, where we might define that, you know, for example, you've had an audit and they basically say that you need a SIM for whatever reason, and you might decide that you don't actually want to run that in-house, you don't want to take that risk, so you'll offload it to someone else and have them take the burden from you. What we choose to do in an organization may be impacted by other factors, which are external to our organization. And those things might be audit findings, where we've had somebody come in and say that we've got a gap that we maybe didn't previously know about. It could be a compliance requirement, where suddenly you're basically required by law or regulation to essentially like comply with something like ISO. And again, it might be regulatory requirements, like you might work in financial services and need to do you may need to comply with PCI requirements and things like that. So to give you an example of these things, you know, like we might have a web server which is weak to SQL injection. it's been found to be possible to extract data from the server, but not necessarily change the data. It doesn't interface with any, it doesn't interface or contain any sensitive data. And depending on the risk appetite of your organization, they might choose to accept that risk and do nothing. However, if your organization is more averse to risk and needs to do something about it, they might choose to mitigate it by either changing the application itself, or maybe implementing some control in front, like putting a WAF in front of it. You might also be aware of how we manage risk at a large scale in terms of using frameworks. So the one that I've got up on screen here is actually the NIST cybersecurity framework and kind of their model. But there's generally different types of frameworks. So this one specifically is what we call a program framework, which covers everything from kind of people and process, as well as the technology controls that you might implement. They generally cover the whole risk management cycle for your organization, and most people will use one of these. You might also have control frameworks like NIST 800-53, and these tend to cover very specific controls that you should implement. They might cover things like access management. They're just kind of like real technology controls. You might also have something more bespoke to kind of threats and sort of vulnerabilities. And these things you might be familiar with in terms of the MITRE ATT&CK framework or cyber kill chain. And they're generally used to kind of categorize threats rather than specific controls around risk. And you might use all three of these. They're kind of independent of each other and work well together. But you might sort of consider using some of these if you don't today. If you're kind of familiar with most security tooling, you'll know that most security vendors kind of align to the MITRE ATT&CK framework. So now we've kind of covered off sort of what risk is and sort of what you might choose to do and how you mitigate it. Where does kind of SIM fit into this space? And like I mentioned before, everything we do in cybersecurity is really just mitigating risk. So rather than a SIM, it's really just a risk mitigator. So SIM generally aids in detecting, analyzing, responding to security threats by giving complete visibility into your organization's technology assets and security controls. You might use it for various different things. So the first piece is log management, not a log toilet. And really what that means is it's a centralized repository of system and user activity. This allows us to provide full forensics audit trail in the event of an incident. So, one of the biggest risks to an organization is if something does happen, do we have a record of it? Can we actually go back and identify the root cause? That's what a SIM does. You can also use it for threat detection, where you have a detection engine capable of alerting on known threats mapped to an organization's known risk areas. So one of the things that I'm going to talk to you about today is how use cases should really be mapped to the risk that you know about in your environment. And we'll get to that as we go through. And it's also about incident response. So we talked about having that full forensic audit trail, but it also provides the capability to really respond to an incident when it's happening. It's about reducing the impact when something happens, because we can identify not just what systems are hit, but all the adjacent systems, and basically really assess the full impact of what's going on in the event of a breach. So really what we're talking about today is how effective a SIM is and how you can make it more effective in your organization. So in reality, a SIM is great. It's a really powerful bit of kit, but it's really only effective if you align it with the goals of your organization. A SIM is really powerful, but just because it can doesn't mean it should. Really what you should be doing when you're sort of building SIM use cases, when you're building your SIM out, is kind of talking to the other areas of the business, seeing what they're doing, what technologies they're implementing, and really evaluating how that can feed into your SIM, which use cases it might be useful, and kind of like what risk areas, what things are those other teams worried about when they're implementing their technology. And every kind of rule, dashboard, and report, so every bit of content within your SIM should really have a purpose and align with known risk. And the biggest part of that is kind of what we really want to talk about today, and that is kind of use case identification, design, build, tuning, and maintenance. So really what we want to have is a standardized process to build these, which is really going to make your SIM much more effective, much easier to justify, and kind of help build like a lower total cost of ownership overall, because you're going to be spending less time maintaining use cases that aren't necessarily useful. So we talk about this every year. You're probably sick of hearing it, but security teams have a lot of challenges. We're generally starved of skilled resource, budget, and time. And particularly SIM in general is quite problematic in this space, because SIM can take a lot of time, it can take a lot of money, and it can take a lot of effort to make effective. So really what you want to do is build a program to kind of utilize your resources, utilize your rock stars effectively. So we all know that most security engineers are really skilled. And particularly with SIM, if you leave them alone, they will try and build really clever use cases. Those use cases might take a long time. But what security engineers aren't always great at is kind of understanding the organization as a whole and building use cases which really matter. So they tend to waste a lot of time and effort on building use cases which don't actually provide value. We've all been guilty of this. We build a use case, we spend a long time on it, we think it's really cool, but then it never ever fires. We never really see the results of that, because it didn't. We don't actually have that risk in our environment. And if you choose to kind of build a strategy, build a process, and prioritize your use case development, in reality, you're going to really enhance your threat coverage. You're going to reduce the workload of your team, because they're going to be spending more time on things that are valuable. You're going to reduce the overall cost, because you're going to have use cases that are really important to you, and you're going to spend less money on log sources that don't necessarily feed those use cases. And it gives you an easier ability to report to senior level, because you will have use cases which are mapped to the known risk of the organization. So I've talked about use case a lot. But what really is a use case? Because you might be thinking, use case, what is that? Is that a rule? The answer is it can be. A use case is really just the overall collection of any sort of content within your SIM. So it might be rules, it might be alerts, it might be contextual data, it could be reports, it could be dashboards, it could be anything. But all these things feed into what we call a use case, and that use case serves to detect a specific threat or vulnerability, which covers risk in our organization. A use case could be a single rule, though. It could be, you might have a concern about a very specific server and a specific user account being compromised, and you might have a single rule that solely looks for that. And one important aspect of a use case is that the time to develop each use case widely varies. So there's no real standard time for building a use case. A simple use case might take you 1 day to build. A complex use case might take you 2 years to build. I've worked with some companies in the past where it's taken us sort of two years, maybe a year, to actually build what they want to do, because it's that complicated. So now we've kind of talked about why you want to do this. Really, what you want to do is create a process. So really, yes, you want to prioritize, but it's really all about creating a strategy and a process for content development. You need to have something that's repeatable, reusable, because even though you have rock stars in your team right now, they might leave, they might go somewhere else, and you need to make sure that if some new people come in, you expand your team, you have a process for them to follow to identify and build use cases. So I've talked a lot about kind of concepts and sort of like why you might want to do it, how it can help. But now you might be asking, how do I actually do this? So I figured I would give you an example of kind of a suggested approach. You don't have to follow this. Like I say, the main idea is that you really just want to create something that works for your organization, works in your environment, and helps you meet your goals. But my suggested approach is to start with the documented risk in your organization. So if you don't have this today, you really should be considering like doing a risk assessment and documenting all the risk areas in your environment. But then once you have that, you really want to map sort of key risk areas to use case categories. So use case categories could be something like a framework, or it could be something bespoke to your environment. So for example, a lot of organizations break it into sort of like network, privileged access management, process process information, just various different categories. Within those categories, you really want to identify and document the use cases. And all the use cases that you identify should be to do with the risk, the most risky assets and the most sort of the highest risk within your organization. And then once you've done that, if you didn't do this when you were coming up with use case categories, you should try and map your use cases to the different frameworks like NIST, ATT&CK, Cyber Kill Chain, because then you can sort of like map it back to sort of industry standards. And one of the things that you should always do when you're building a use case is really consider any mitigating factors. So we talked about that SQL injection example before. If you have an SQL server and it's behind, say, a proxy, behind a WAF, but that's one of your high risk areas, do you really need to spend a lot of time building a SIM use case for it if you already have a lot of protections in place for it? I talked a little bit before about how use cases can take a long time to build, and that time can vary wildly. You really should kind of, this will come over time as you sort of like identify and build use cases, but you really should get the idea of how you kind of estimate the time it's going to take to build a use case, because you want to make sure you assign the resources correctly and make sure that those resources aren't overworked, they're not spending too much time building them. You really just want to make sure that like they have enough time to build what they need to and they don't feel the pressure. So most use cases take at least 5 days. That doesn't necessarily mean that they take 5 days if somebody's sitting on it working full time, but it will take some time to build, usually a day or 2 days. But then there's various stages afterwards. There's the initial tuning of a rule, tuning out those false positives. Does it, and then sort of integrating it with any existing capabilities like reports and dashboards and just making sure it all runs smoothly. And then there's obviously maintenance afterwards in terms of like every year you might spend a day kind of refining it and making sure it still works. But again, over time, you will get better at time estimating. You should also document everything that you do. So this is a really important aspect as well. A use case is not just the actual content that you build, but it's also kind of the ongoing maintenance. It's also what you do with it as the output. So like, yes, it should document exactly how the use case is built. It should document kind of, how you tune it, how you maintain it, but it should also document the kind of what you do when this use case fires. So how do we remediate any findings from it? How do we conduct an investigation on it? And what kind of what we should do with that information? Should we pass it to another team? Should we go and remediate it ourselves? What should you do with that? And all that needs to be documented, because again, your resources that you have now might not be the same resources that you have in a year's time. So let's go into kind of a really practical example. A company's risk register has this as its number one risk, and this is really common. A lot of people are worried about this. And this one specifically is kind of like having a lack of privileged access management solution, which means all our critical systems, really, we kind of like have this risk of internal misuse, whether that's malicious or just accidental. We have this worry that kind of like that sensitive information might get leaked. Again, we kind of want to break that into a category. Here I'm saying user access management. We have various mitigations in place. We have a change control process. We do have a password vault, but it's not an actual full privileged access management solution, which means somebody could actually technically just keep those passwords forever and never check them out of the password vault. There might also be additional categories that we consider, like system compromise. If somebody actually does misuse the system, what kind of things can happen? It might just be policy violations. Does somebody actually follow the change control process? Does somebody check the credential out of the password vault? So it could just be policy violations. So we kind of want to think about all the things that might surround our use case as well. What we probably also need to know, of course, because this is about kind of privileged access management in our critical systems, we need to find out what contextual information we need. So we need to know what systems are in scope, what the risk is of those systems, what do they actually contain. We need to make sure we have the context surrounding those assets and make sure they're covered by our SIM. We need to know which privileged accounts exist on them. Like if we're trying to protect for privileged access management, we need to know what that privileged access accounts are. We need to know which groups control those systems. So for example, if you have it with AD, or even if you just have like Linux and you have some sort of group management, you kind of need to know which groups are also associated with those, because what if somebody just adds themselves to one of those groups? And we also kind of need to know what actual applications are run in those systems. So we know the systems in the scope, we know what they do, but we also might want to know the actual individual applications that run on them. So to take that further, we're now talking about the actual content that we want to build. So we come from that initial category, that user access control, and we can build these free use cases from there. There's probably a lot more that we could build here. This is just an example, but we might build these free rules. We could build a rule that says log on to privileged account and critical system, using that contextual information and really making sure we're building it bespoke to that risk. So we're checking for those privileged accounts we identified, and only on the systems that we know are in scope of our rule, which does two things. It firstly makes it much more bespoke to our risk, but also cuts down on the actual log sources that we need, because we're basically really focused on the risk element. We might also check for those additional categories, like those policy violations and things. We want to check if the credentials that we have in the scope are actually accessed from the password vault or not. And that information could also be correlated to ensure that the login was actually used after that was checked out on the correct system. We could also check, did somebody log into the privileged system but didn't check the credential out, which means somebody had the access to the credential outside of the vault. We can check all these things for correlation, which obviously adds more complexity, which might increase the time estimate. We might also check for accounts being added to the privileged groups. Just make sure that nobody's sort of modifying those groups, changing the permissions, or having accounts added to them. So to summarize that into kind of more business speak, we can build free use cases with 15 days of time, which mitigates our organization's biggest risk, which has a lot more value when you talk to somebody higher up outside of the technical organization than necessarily saying, look, we've built these 5 rules without any context attached to them. We should think about how we actually get those logs. How do we get them in? How do we parse them? Does our SIM that we have chosen provide parsing for those logs? Do we need to do it ourselves? If not, do we need to work with the team that owns those logs? We also need to think about where we put the contextual information. So we talked about how we have those privileged accounts, we have those critical systems. Where do those actually live within our use case? Do they live within a lookup table within Greylog? Do they live in somewhere external that we reference every time the use case runs? Where do we need to store that information? And then we also think, like, if we do have all these different log sources and all this different contextual information, how do we correlate them together? You also need to think about how you tune it and refine it long term. So of course, we talked about how at the start, you need to tune it for sort of false positives, make sure it works correctly. But you might also need to think about long-term tuning and refining. So are the same accounts kind of valid in a year's time compared to now? What happens if there's new accounts? What happens if there's new systems? How do we get that list? How do we update the list? How do we keep that information up to date? And how do you manage the kind of whitelist, blacklist, the kind of tuning aspect of it? Do we need to sort of like revisit this every 6 months, every 12 months? Do we need to kind of add more systems, remove systems from it? Are we still worried about the same things? And you should also make sure, again, because documentation is a big part of it, that all the criteria of the use case is documented, the search syntax is understood, and it should be documented in a way that somebody that's maybe non-technical or somebody that isn't as familiar with the system understands. So try and avoid like the really in-depth technical details of how it works. If you visited my talk last year, you'll know that I love kind of metrics and start presenting the information in a clean way. So what you can do is you can build up a matrix like this. So we talked about in this example that you should maybe map your use cases back to kind of frameworks. So here we have those 3 rules that we talked about. We have the different log sources. So here, for example, some log sources are, some of these rules might require a lot more log sources than others. For example, that second one, the kind of credential being accessed from a password vault, only requires one log source, but the others might require sort of domain controller logs. It might require the application logs, might require the server logs. And those can be mapped to our risk matrix or our risk register, where we have that R125 value. And then those use cases or rules can be mapped back to different frameworks. So here it might be the cyber kill chain stages, like installation exploitation. It could be the actual NIST 853 controls, like AC2, AC7, or it could be like a MITRE attack technique like T1078. And that just helps you sort of keep this matrix presented, know what techniques your coverage is. And you might also want to break that into more metric-oriented things as well for presenting to senior leadership. Like here, you might want to have those use case categories that we talked about before, how many rules they cover, or how many rules you have in place, how many risks on the risk register those rules mitigate. You might also want to say like how many audit findings those rules cover. And then you could break it into things like this, where you say percentage of risk register covered by our SIM. You could also say something like percentage of critical systems protected by our SIM. So you should always be thinking about, when you're building these things, how do I present that information back to sort of senior leadership as well. And of course, one of the things that I should always say is we kind of have come to terms with this over time in security, but it's a question of kind of when, not if. So at some point, you will miss something in your SIM, or miss something in general from a security incident. You might not have coverage of that system. You might not have a use case. You might not even have the logs for it. But really, what you really want to avoid is essentially missing something that was a known risk to your organization. So something's in the risk register and it's high priority, you should really have it in your SIM. And of course, I wouldn't really be a Greylog employee if I didn't talk to you about how kind of Greylog can help with some of the things that we talked about before. So for example, we've implemented various features in our 6.0 release and our 6.1 release to kind of help with some of the things that I've kind of talked about today. The first is kind of like the cost effectiveness of your solution and how the logs that you have should really only feed the use cases that you have in your SIM. But one of the capabilities that we also have is, if a use case doesn't necessarily feed, if a log message doesn't necessarily feed a use case, we allow you to route those messages directly into cold storage. And what that means is essentially like you don't necessarily index it. You don't necessarily put it through the processing pipelines. You don't necessarily need to actually store it in the costly SIM. You can basically just put it straight in cold storage. And then if later on you choose that you want that data, again, one of the things that SIM provides is kind of that full audit trail for forensics analysis. If you do end up needing that data at some point, because it's that question of when, not if, or it's that question of when, not if, you can pull that data back in if you ever need it. We also have our sort of compliance content mapped to NIST 853. So those sort of control frameworks, and those control frameworks can be easily mapped to sort of threat frameworks like MITRE ATT&CK and things like that, or various compliance frameworks like HIPAA or PCI or anything like that. So we have content mapped to these control frameworks. And we also basically have support for MITRE ATT&CK coverage. So we can help you basically visualize how much techniques that you're covering with your content, your rule sets that you've got in Greylog. And we can also help with that in sort of a visual way within Greylog. So now I've talked to you about a lot of things. I've talked to you about risk, what it is, why it's important. I've talked to you about where the SIM fits in, why you should kind of prioritize use case and sort of map that to the risk within your organization, how it can help you. And just some closing thoughts, really, if I want you to take something away from this talk, you should really be thinking about, if you don't have one today, creating a use case development strategy and process, which will in turn save you a lot of time, money, and headaches. And it will also make it much easier to kind of justify your SIM spend because it's mapped to sort of your organization's risk. And then you're also helping the organization as a whole mitigate the risk sort of aligning your sim goals to the organization goals, and making everybody's life easier. Thank you for coming to the talk. Hopefully you enjoyed. And if you've got any questions, please pop them in the chat and we'll get them answered.